seasonal forecast from Colorado State. They do a terrific job every single year getting that out nice and early. What does that mean for our season here along the Gulf Coast?
Well, sounds like from what they've put out, I think they had 13 named storms, 5 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes, and on average, 12 hurricanes, 12 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So it sounds, from what they've put out here, about like an average year, maybe, with the major storms and hurricanes, maybe a little less, but overall kind of an average year. We expect the NOAA National Hurricane Center forecast to come out here by the end of May, and all indications are that it will be similar, around the average season, right around what we would normally get in an average year.
I was looking back at some of the analogous El Nino years, and maybe explain to folks at home kind of what El Nino does before we even get to that. What El Nino does to a hurricane.
Well, El Nino, as you may be aware, is a warming of the ocean waters in the Pacific Ocean. And the warmer the waters over there, the waters of the oceans and the atmosphere are kind of two processes that work together. And if they're warm over there, the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, what that tends to do is create more wind shear out over the Atlantic Ocean, more upper level strong winds, and that's not conducive to tropical development. So on an average year, if you do have El Nino in effect, typically the number of tropical systems in the Atlantic is a little lower, simply because they can't really get going. They have a lot of wind shear to work with and opposes the development of the systems.
So, like I was saying, I was looking back at some of the analogous years, and it was like 77, 80, 77, 69, and 53.
Okay.
And in terms of numbers, that's like all over the map for us. 69, we had 18 storms.
Right.
77, there was like 6.
Yeah.
And so, is there, on weak El Ninos, like the one that we're dealing with, it doesn't seem to really matter as much?
It doesn't. I mean, it depends on the strength of the El Nino. And this one, we are in El Nino now, and the forecasts are for it to kind of linger into the heart of hurricane season. There's about a 60% chance or so of that happening. But the weaker ones, just because of the way things work, the weaker the El Nino, the less it influences the wind shear in the Atlantic. And so you can still get development, maybe more so if it was a very strong El Nino. Now, one of the things is for El Nino, the shear that's more in the Atlantic basin area out in the tropical Atlantic. For the Gulf, you still may be able to have a fairly active season, maybe nothing incredibly strong, but things develop near home, and we could still have a pretty active season along the Gulf Coast, regardless of if there's an El Nino or not.
Can you tell me about how you guys always message that it only takes one system to have an active season for you?
Right.
So if it's an inactive season, we only get 6 storms, but 3 of them are in the Gulf.
It could still be an active season for us. And actually, 1997 is a good example of that. El Nino year, maybe only 6 or 8 storms, but one of them formed in the Gulf, and it was Hurricane Danny, and it hit right here in Mobile. It was a Category 1 hurricane. So even though that was a very inactive season, it was still a busy, active year for the Gulf Coast area. And it goes the other way, too. Some years, I think 2010, I believe it was, very active year, and very few storms in the Gulf at all, but the map was just covered with hurricane tracks out in the Atlantic. So, it's just where they develop primarily, and El Nino really doesn't have any effect on that.
Yeah, and so the variability on where we get development is more than a week-to-week thing rather than a seasonal thing?
Right, yeah. Atmosphere is completely changing every few days. It's not sitting still. It's always developing. So you can't really look at a longer range time period to see where development may occur. That conditions may be development across the whole area for a higher than normal year or lower, But you've really got to look more on a week-to-week time frame to know once you get into the season where the development will be. Yeah.
All right. So speaking of closer to home, what is that loop current that we weather people are always talking about?
Well, the way the currents, this is the Gulf of Mexico loop current you're talking about, and it's a warmer eddy of water. The Gulf Stream, or the waters tend to come around out of the Caribbean, around the western tip of Cuba, then curve back through the Florida Straits, and then up the east coast is a Gulf Stream, and those are very warm waters, and when they curve around there as you go into the Florida Straits there, sometimes little eddies kind of pinch off of it and drift up into the Gulf of Mexico. And what that does is essentially put a very warm pool of water in the middle part of the Gulf. And with tropical systems, you need warm water. So sometime you may have a very warm pool of water in the central Gulf there. And of course, the hurricane tracks come across that. And if the conditions are right atmospherically, you can get intensification pretty quick.
Certain area that people should kind of keep tabs on in terms of hurricane development along the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, I mean, obviously anything that develops in the Gulf itself, but the Atlantic storms, if they're low latitude and look like they may be able to come up through the Yucatan Channel, which is the body of water between Mexico and western Cuba there, or the Florida Straits, Keys down to Cuba, those are the two channels where a hurricane can make it into the Gulf of Mexico without any, land interference. So if you've got a storm out in the Atlantic and you see something coming toward either of those channels, it's something to particularly pay attention to. But of course, it could cross Cuba and still wind up in the Gulf and re-intensify as well.
Okay, so let's play a hypothetical game. It's not a fun one, but we're going to play it. We have a tropical system somewhere. Let's say it's out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Hurricane watches and warnings are in effect for the area. What should people do when they get the alert on their phone or on their NOAA weather radio that says a hurricane watch is now in effect?
Well, when you got to have a hurricane watch in effect, that generally the watch comes out 48 hours or so before any expected impacts. That's what we try to do, 48 hours. So once you've got a watch, you should be prepared before the season even begins, have a supply kit, that type thing, and have an idea of what your plans would be should we have a tropical system. But once the watch is out, just start putting all that stuff into play. Know where you would go if evacuation orders come. If you haven't stocked up, that's a good time to do it. And also, leading up to the watch period, quite often we already have an indication that we're going to have a system in the area even before the watch period. But even if you don't, that's the time that you start making your preparations around your house and preparing for the storm as well.
And then when the warning is then issued, so if it's 48 hours for the watch, when is the warning
It's
issued?
36 hours.
Okay. And at that point in time, is there anything different that people should do when a hurricane warning is issued as opposed to a watch?
Well, you should be continuing to prepare and also rushing those preparations, to completion, because once the warning is out, you only have a shorter period of time before the tropical storm force winds arrive, and they will arrive before the hurricane force winds. And what we tend to do is we want to prepare and the watches and warnings be out in advance of those tropical storm force winds, because once they arrive, it's difficult to prepare and make, preparations for the storm and protect your property once the winds are already coming up. So watches and warnings are based off tropical storm force winds as opposed to the hurricane winds, which would arrive earlier than the hurricane winds.
So, speaking of the watch warning, so the last couple of seasons, we've had hurricane watches and warnings in effect all along the Gulf Coast.
Right.
Things like subtropical storm Alberto and Hurricane Nate, tropical storm Gordon, and these aren't a devastating system.
Right.
For people that have been put underneath these warnings and have went through the same thing that you highlighted, so okay, well, I got my kit. I boarded up the house, I got ready to go, and then Hurricane Nate comes along, and we didn't live on Dauphin Island, so we didn't see many impacts at all. So the next time the warning comes out, they go, well, maybe this isn't that big of a deal. What does the Weather Service have to say to those folks that may be a little skeptical about impacts?
Well, each storm is different, and like you said, many of them are very low-end storms. And the thing is, the way tropical systems work, it's the very core of that system that is the most intense part of the storm. And whether it's a strong storm or a weaker storm, if you don't get the very center of that, you've really not had the worst of the storm. So we would like people to prepare for a very strong hurricane, no matter what they've experienced in the past, because it only really takes one time to really be a major issue. And a good example of that was Hurricane Michael over in Panama City this year. The area had never been hit by a hurricane that strong, and a lot of folks compared it, well, we lived through Opal back in '95, so we'll be all right this time around. But Opal, it was a Category 5 at one time out over the Gulf, but it weakened to a 3 or so before landfall. Plus, it hit near Pensacola, not Panama City. So it's how close you are to the storm, how strong it will ultimately be. But you should be prepared for a major hurricane if you live along the Gulf Coast, because kind of what we like to say, it's not if one will ever hit, but when. Sooner or later, your stretch of the coast will see a major storm.
I think the return period for us is what, like 12 to 18 years?
I think so. If you kind of average it out, a hurricane is like 10 years, I think, around our area. It kind of varies from the Mississippi, Louisiana, over the Florida Panhandle, but around 10 years for a hurricane. And it's closer to 20, 25, 28 years or so for a major hurricane. Now, we've had more, higher frequency than that over the last decade. That's averaged out over a long period of time.
All right, so since Michael just happened, should people let their guard down since the Gulf Coast just got a major hurricane?
No, even though the return period is several decades on average, each year is different. And if you really think about it, we've had Katrina, Ivan, Dennis, Michael now. All these have been major hurricanes between southeast Louisiana and the Florida Panhandle here over, the last 10 years or so. So that's much higher than that average, frequency of major hurricanes. So just because there was one last year, you hope it's another 20, 30, 40 years, but it may be this year, so you need to be prepared for that.
And then what is it about the shelf waters in particular that makes them any cooler than out over the open Gulf of Mexico?
Yeah, well, a lot of those times when those type storms happen when they move in, it's a little later in the year, so you may have already had a cold front or two come through. But in general, that Gulf Loop that we were talking about earlier, it may be where they don't generally come up to the coast. So the waters may be Caribbean type warm water, squeezes off into the middle part of the Gulf. It's not going to make it up to the northern part of the Gulf. But as the storm approaches too, you also get something called upwelling, which pulls cold water from the depths up. And as it moves towards shore, that's also on that shallower, because you would think the shallower water would be warmer, due to just more radiation. But there's a lot of different currents and processes that the water closer to the coast is usually quite a bit cooler. I mean, not cold, obviously, still in the 80s, but compared to the central Gulf, it's cooler. And that's happened with many of the storms we've had. They weaken as they come ashore. Now, last year, the Gulf was abnormally warm, even for in October when the Michael hit, several degrees above what it normally would be. So Michael had a lot of fuel to work with.
Speaking of Michael, that thing stayed pretty hot all the way inland.
Right.
That hurricane center, okay, now it's landfall. Are you still working with them and kind of coordinating?
Yeah. As long as it remains a hurricane, no matter really how far inland it gets, the Hurricane Center is still putting out advisories. We're still coordinating for our area until it leaves the area. Now, eventually, as it weakens, the Weather Prediction Center up in Washington takes over. But as long as it's still a hurricane, there are watches and warnings in effect, and still a very well-defined tropical system, the Hurricane Center will be working, even with inland offices as it moves inland, coordinating those watches and warnings and what conditions you can expect.
And that was more of a wind storm,
right.
we say.
Yeah.
it's been a long time since our region of the Gulf Coast has
Right.
had a true wind
Right.
storm.
A lot of our hurricanes have been surge storms here where the immediate beach can take a pretty hard hit, but inland, while you have damage and some, you know, some infrastructure damage and power and stuff like that, it's not been nearly as significant as what Michael was. Luckily, we just don't, part of it is that cooler shelf water, but luckily we just don't get that kind of storm that often.
And so people that in my area up in Hattiesburg, they lived through Katrina. A lot of them lived through Camille.
Right.
Would those be considered stereotypical wind storms?
They were, in the fact that Camille especially, it was Category 5 at landfall, moving very quickly, so it was still a good solid 3 or so, 2 or 3 as it moved up into the interior there, kind of toward Marion County. I think it went right over that county, the center of the storm. And they were very much wind hurricanes on the scale of the scope of maybe the area covered by the severe damage. It was more limited in those. One, because Camille was a very small storm, and then up in your area for Katrina, while it was still a very good, windstorm, it had weakened significantly. But you get a very strong Category 4, Category 5 hurricane, especially if it's moving very fast or very quickly. The wind damage, extreme wind damage, can occur well inland, certainly up in the Hattiesburg area.
The big threat for our area seems to be inland flooding, generally speaking, more than wind. Is there anything people should know about? I mean, everyone knows what to do when it's windy, right? You just go inside and you hope to God the tree doesn't fall on your house.
Yeah.
But for inland flooding during a hurricane or a tropical system that's making landfall, do you guys have any tips for folks what they should do or keep an eye out for?
Well, just listen for the Weather Service, the local offices will still be putting out flooding information, flash flood watches, warnings, that type thing, and the amounts. And just know your terrain. If you're in an area that's susceptible to flooding, if you get 2 feet of rain, which you could easily get in a hurricane. I know in Michael, in just 3 hours, they got nearly 12 inches in the Panama City area just from the core moving over them. So it's going to rain quite heavily, and if you're in an area that's prone to flooding, we evacuate along the coast for storm surge, and that's about 49% of all fatalities of storm surge in a tropical system, but another 27 or so is from freshwater flooding. So if you're in an area that you feel like or that from experiences will flood, whether anybody really tells you to get out or not, it may be a smart move to just try to move to a relative or friend and somewhere in higher ground.
And then we tend to get the tornadoes that come along with the hurricanes as well. Those seem to be a little different than the normal tornadoes that we tend to get.
Yeah.
There's a short lead time on these. They tend to come up and go away pretty quickly. Is there anything that folks should maybe be on the lookout for or paying extra attention to during a landfalling tropical system with respect to the tornadoes?
Yeah, especially if where your area is, if you're located to the north and east of where the storm's coming in, the likelihood of tornadoes is a lot greater there. Basically just the same tornado preparation, just be prepared to move to an interior room. If a watch or warnings issue, there would be a watching effect normally. But like you said, they're usually a little weaker, but a tornado is a tornado. If it hits your house, it's still a bad day. And you talk about how quick they spin up. The thing is, they're very low in the atmosphere, and there's a lot going on, flow-wise in a hurricane, so it's more difficult to get out a warning well in advance because, one, they just don't last that long. They'll pop up, like you say, and then diminish just as quickly. But for a small area there, they still could cause quite a bit of damage.
So what causes those to be such quick spinners?
Well, the main thing is, there's still a lot of shear in the atmosphere, and that's what you need, but it's almost like, too much in a hurricane. Things are moving very quickly, and the primary thing is just that the storm's moving inland quickly, and they're rotating around the storm as it comes in, so they're very fast movers. And while there are tornadoes that develop, the conditions are right in those northeast quadrants especially. but they're just weaker type storms normally that just don't last as long.
So the good news is people don't have to worry about getting a hurricane and getting an EF4 or an EF5.
Not generally, but you could get the hurricane and a tornado. And the thing is, if you get the core of a very strong hurricane, people, just human nature, I guess it is, they want to claim or assume that it must have been tornadoes in that. But if you get the eye wall, you've got the eye wall, and there may be some gust of very strong winds that can leave a little path. But in general, you're not going to get tornadoes near the center of the storm. They'll be out on the periphery. And again, that's why your area there in Jackson or Hattiesburg area in southeast Mississippi get a lot more tornadoes because they're inland, usually away from the center of the storm.
Okay. Walk me through those. Like, how do I read those? Because there are a couple of different options.
There are two. There's one they put out, and they're based on the forecast itself, how fast the storm's moving and different things like that. But they give you an idea. There's a most likely time for a tropical storm wind's arrival, and again, tropical storm because that's what we use for preparation. And then there's a earliest time of tropical storm force winds. And when you're preparing for a hurricane, if you see if you want to know, how much time you have to prepare, the earliest reasonable time of arrival of tropical storm force winds is what you would want to use. And what it gives you, there's only a 10% chance or so that tropical storm force winds will be in your area, wherever that timeline is across there, at those times. So there's a 90% chance you won't have any tropical storm force winds. So that's the time you want to prepare. If you've got a low tolerance and don't want to be out in tropical storm force winds, you want to be finished and buttoned down before any of the effects move into your area. That earliest reasonable time of arrival is the chart that you want to use. And it's usually anywhere from 12, 24 hours faster than the most likely time. And the most likely time is a kind of an equal chance, 50-50 chance that you will have tropical storm force winds. You can't be guaranteed that there won't be any tropical storm force winds based on the forecast for your area at that time. So you want to be completely prepared by that time. So earlier in the storm, you want to use the earliest reasonable time because it gives you some leeway. As the storm approaches and gets much closer, and we know more when the landfall time would occur, the most likely form is what you would want to use.
And getting back to these maps, the hurricane center, that cone is getting real skinny.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting pretty good. How do they figure out what that cone, how big that cone is going to be?
Yeah, well, what they do for each year, they go back for the previous 5 years and just calculate what their forecast track error was. And of course, with the models getting better, the understanding of the meteorology getting better, all these things over the last several years, especially the last couple of decades, each year they're making improvements on that. In fact, this past year, the track records for all hours, 24, 12, 24, 36, out to 120, set records for accuracy. They were well within, the 12-hour forecast was maybe 20 miles, and the 120 is only about 150 miles. Years ago, the 120 forecast could be anywhere from Brownsville to Tampa. They just didn't know. But they've really got that now where it, it's really honed in for the times or for the areas the storm will arrive. And in fact, a couple of the storms this past year, the 120-hour forecast point was within 20 miles or so of where landfall was. So it may have taken a roundabout way to get there in some cases, but things continually change, and if you can hit it early, the earlier the better. But each year that shrinks, and it will shrink again this year compared to what last year, just based off their record accuracy last year.
I was going to say, yeah, because Michael was incredibly well forecast,
right?
And not only by the Hurricane Center, but I think the models actually ended
up
doing a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm.
And then Florence,
yeah,
was one of those things where at 120 hours out,
yeah,
it was
the landfall location was very close to where they pinpointed it at 120 hours. So, the models and meteorology, everything's improved to the point where, you know, consistently for the last decade, every year that thing shrunk. Now, sooner or later, you know, you're probably going to get where it's not as much, but they did a very good job last year at all. You know, you get the forecast points for 12, 24, 36, 48 hours. Last year, there was an improvement and very small deviations from where the storm was as compared to where it wound up. You know, better than ever before.
Did I break something?
Yeah, I think generator. Today must be Wednesday, so we have a generator test.
That's how we know.
Yeah.
But how valuable is it to have all of this great technology now to put together these forecasts, even from a local level? You guys aren't even the hurricane center, but
Right.
at a local level, it's got to be so helpful.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it helps us have confidence in their forecast, and we know they're doing a very good job. But, you know, like when you see these spaghetti models, some of them are models that don't handle certain situations as well as others. So, you know, the public, when they see those on the screen, you know, they tend to focus on the one that comes to their house. But a lot of those models, you know, based on what we know about how the model performs, you can throw half of those out just from the get-go, you know. So, but the forecasting ability between the models and just the understanding of everything has improved dramatically. And, you know, talking about Katrina as you did, if you compare a map or a cone from the past couple of years to Katrina, Katrina had 100 miles on either side of the current cones. And it was still, you know, people, well, it was all over the place. And early in the forecast it was. Now, they finally got one of the planes in there that circles the periphery of the storm when it was down around the Yucatan Channel. And once that happened, this was 2 days out, it pretty much locked in on southeast Louisiana, and they never really changed the track again. You know, I don't know, people, I guess people just feel like they're never prepared and don't expect, they're not expecting the worst when you really should be. You should expect the worst but hope for the best, and I think that catches a lot of people. I know even in Michael over in Panama City, you know, I know a lot of folks over there, and they're, well, you know, it's kind of snuck up on us, but, you know, it was known from the model data that there would be a tropical system in that area, very likely, about 8 days before it ever even occurred. Now, you don't know it's going to be a Category 5, but you have some inkling. And the thing was with Michael, it was one of these storms that underwent what we call rapid intensification. And the last, you know, I think 24 hours or so went from a Category 1 almost to a 5. They reclassified it as a 5. So people feel like, well, we didn't have enough warning. And in the aspect that you were expecting a 1 versus a 5, maybe not so much, but rapid intensification is one of the more difficult things to forecast, if not the most difficult thing. So you should always, kind of the rule of thumb there is no matter what the forecast is, you should always prepare for 1 category higher just to be safe.
Yeah, and maybe even 2 now.
And maybe even 2, you know. And, you know, if conditions are favorable, atmospheric, if it goes over a warm eddy, that type, it could explode very quickly from a Category 1 all the way to near a 5, you know. And you just hope that it maybe weakens before it gets to, because Opal did very much the same thing, but it was far enough out in the Gulf it weakened. We could have easily had a Category 5 move ashore around Pensacola in Opal, but, you know, things went our way and it had weakened, you know, so.
Take me back. So the Katrina thing, the little anecdote, the plane flying around. So the hurricane hunters, right? We've got the ones that go. Everyone knows about the guys that go right into
through
the
the center, yeah.
But they had one that was flying around the outside of it.
Right.
How does that help?
Well, how that helps, it's a Gulfstream aircraft. It's a jet aircraft, and it doesn't so much, or it doesn't at all, penetrate the interior of the storm, but it flies around the periphery, and not just right there at the storm, but out quite a distance from the storm. And what they do is they just gather data, you know, meteorological data, wind speed, direction, things like that in the mid and upper levels around the storm. And that's what drives or steers a hurricane, those winds and stuff out away from the storm at certain levels. And, you know, you're out over the ocean, there are no observations up there. So the models are only as good as what gets put into them. Now, if you're getting data from these aircraft that are flying a wide area around the storm, you can input that model into the data and say, well, this is what's actually happening right now. And once that data's in, the models, which are already good many times, can even increase accuracy even more. And that's what happened with Katrina. You know, it was kind of back and forth, but they didn't have a lot of good environmental data around the storm. That plane got in there, and almost from the get-go, the forecast track and the models locked in on pretty much the path that it followed, and that was maybe a couple of days before. But the previous couple of days, it had been kind of windshield wiper and all over the place. So the more data, the better. I mean, and that's why that plane flies.
I was gonna say, so as a good kind of rule of thumb, you could say that until we get hurricane hunters in and around the storm, you may not have a great idea of where any one particular tropical system is going.
Right.
But once they get that data, maybe the forecast gets a little better.
Yeah, it gets a lot better with the aircraft data. And the thing is, you know, the stronger the storm gets, you can defer more, you know, or infer more about the storm and the environment from satellite data. So a very strong storm, you're going to have a better forecast than a very weak storm. The models they know where the center of that storm is. A weaker storm or a developing storm, you know, there may be several different centers, and the models just really don't know whichever one you pick. If it's the wrong one, your forecast is completely off. So the weaker storms are much tougher to forecast than the stronger ones. But once they're strong enough, even without the plane, satellite imagery is very good at determining the environment, which helps the models.
The storm is here, and the line starts over here. Can they just dismiss that model and say, well, hey, that line isn't starting in the middle of the storm?
If it doesn't start where the storm is, it's already wrong. So if you have the center of the storm here and there's a model with a track route over your house over here that starts over here, yeah, just throw that one out for now. Now, it may be a good model. It may be somehow it just didn't initialize well at the time, but anything that's not current from the beginning is not, the chances of it being correct later on are not very good. Cyclone.
The potential tropical cyclone. What's the deal with that thing?
Well, a couple of years ago we started this, especially for the Gulf it's helpful. If a system has not developed yet, but it has the potential to become a tropical storm or a hurricane in the next 48 hours and have an impact to land, what the Hurricane Center has started doing is putting out potential cyclone advisories for a potential cyclone. And people often get confused about those because it's not actually a tropical cyclone yet. But if we're expecting it to become one in the next 48 hours and impact land in the next 48 hours, those advisories are helpful because once the advisories are out, we can put out watches, we can put out warnings, you get a track forecast, that type thing. All the pertinent information that you need that you would have with a true tropical cyclone, you also get where you can make preparations for the approaching storm that at the time may not quite yet be a tropical cyclone, but you know, all indications are that it likely will be, and it will be affecting land before you know, just a couple of days. So there's not a lot of time to prepare.
So you say, in essence, this is the idea for people not being caught off guard,
Right.
by a rapidly intensifying system close to land.
Right. That's what the potential cyclone is for. The advisories are for. And you know, it's kind of a new thing, and people still seem to not understand it. But it's just telling you that you very likely could have a tropical cyclone make landfall, you know, within the next 48 hours. And that's typically happens more in the Gulf because it's a smaller body of water surrounded by land. So you don't have a lot of time to prepare, especially for homegrown type systems.
And can I ask a silly question that you may not have the answer to? Why not just issue watches, warnings, advisories, whatever, on a system that doesn't have a potential tropical cyclone? Like, you know, why can't it just be Invest 97L watch?
Well, yeah. The main thing is, like with the Invest, you know, a potential cyclone while it may not be a totally pure tropical cyclone, it's a little more well developed. An invest sometimes can be just a disturbed area of weather, no center, no nothing. And you really can't, when we get these invests, and in fact they do start running the models on invest, but those tracks can be just all over the place because there's, as we discussed earlier, there's just nothing in the lower levels really to focus on and say this is your initial point for the storm. So they're very much, the accuracy of those is even less than the potential cyclone. By the time you get to that point, you've somewhat got a feature that you can focus on. An invest is just a disturbed area that they want to monitor, that models indicate, 2, 3, 4 days down the road may develop into something. But at this current time, there's nothing to really focus on, and you wouldn't have anything to really put a watch or a warning for. You just have no real, it's beyond the science to know where it may be in 3 days, 4 days. So that's the main thing with that. They started the potential cyclone simply because over the last couple of years prior to that, there were a few storms that did develop into something, but they really couldn't really have the watches and warnings out because they didn't have a named storm out there or a potential storm.
They had nothing to warn people or watch people
Right.
for.
You could say there's a disturbance there and it's getting organized, but the way a lot of the products and things in the Weather Service work, they've got to have the system in the hurricane centers, the way they do things, it's either got to be potential or named to start putting out the watches and warnings.
Okay. And so, with that, I think it was it Alberto? One of them recently skipped right over tropical depression. They went from ETC to tropical storm. And I think that confused some people, but that's okay. That's not a weird thing.
No, it's a normal thing. You're talking 1 mile an hour here sometime between whether it's a tropical depression or a tropical storm. And systems can be, well organized enough, but on the weaker end, you may still not know exactly what the conditions are from satellite, but you get that first plane in there, it's 42 mile an hour winds. So it's already a tropical storm, but that's fairly common. People tend to want to see the depression, storm, hurricane, and that's the way they progress. But you may, some of these phases may be relatively short-lived, and you just may miss it. So it's not unusual at all to go from, just a disturbance to, hey, we've got a tropical storm.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Okay, no problem.
And